the expectation in springtime was that this would be an incredibly difficult summer for Ukraine. Now, it has been incredibly difficult, but have Russia made the advances that they would have expected given the resources they've expended? Absolutely not. And I think part of that is Russia is not the only country that's learnt. And if I was to be really simplistic, if you are on the offense, you generally lose 4 or 5 times more soldiers than you do on the defense, because you have to leave your foxholes and charge at the enemy, metaphorically speaking. And of course, Ukraine has become very smart, particularly with the use of drones, and making it very difficult for Russia to make any tangible progress. Now, but let's not kid ourselves. They are on the front foot. Russia is taking ground and settlements, but the Donbas, without getting too much in the detail, there's a line of towns in the Donbas, and those towns are really difficult to take. You'll remember the battle for Bakhmut took a year, 60,000 casualties, and the place was leveled. There are 3 of those Bakhmuts in a line, and the chances of Russia taking those anytime soon is very slim. Why does Russia want them? Because then it's got a toehold, a springboard to go much deeper into Ukraine when it wants to. Why does it not want Ukraine to have them? Because Ukraine could use them as springboard to sever the land bridge. And therefore, that's why those are sort of non-negotiable for Russia. But I think that's one of the reasons why I think we heard some of our European leaders talking this week about preparing for the long war, because it doesn't feel like we're going to get a solution anytime soon to the current conflict.
And last week was another week of intense Russian strikes on Kiev. What's the objective that the Russians are trying to achieve with that bombardment of largely civilian areas? And is it having any tangible strategic effect?
Yeah, I ended up doing quite a few chats over after that strikes, because in the same sort of words, basically, I think there were nearly one particular night last week, there were over 600 drone strikes, 31 missile strikes, a lot of civilians killed, and a lot of civilian damage being done. And there were lots of questions about, so why is Russia targeting civilians? Is this just, and it's easier to paint Putin as the bad guy. Why are you doing that? Now, regardless of whether he's a bad guy or not, it's not the point is, you don't generally have excessive amounts of drones and missiles, so you don't want to waste them. And any loss of life is tragic, but if you're going to win a war, you're not going to win the war by killing a few civilians. You're going to focus on your military targets. So I have no doubt at all that, so the question is, what is Russia actually targeting? In the war up till now, in the winter, Russia's targeted energy infrastructure to make life as miserable as possible for people in Kyiv. And in the summer, it's tended to focus on transport and logistics hubs, stuff like that. The big thing that's changed this year is that President Zelensky is very, very determined to get the defense industrial base of Ukraine up and firing. He talked famously about wanting to generate 1 million drones from their own industry, and also there are some other weapons which you might get onto that they've developed as well. Now, if you can take out the energy infrastructure, if you can target those factories, now all of a sudden you start to make a difference to the front line, and that is where I think, plus the F-16s, don't forget those. They are making a difference. Russia is undoubtedly trying to target those, and there's another story about how they're being survivable. So then the question becomes, if they try to target those, why are they hitting so many civilian buildings? Well, you only have to look at the stats. 600 drones. Ukraine claims that 90% of them they shoot down or jam or whatever. Where do they come down? You shoot them down, you jam them. It doesn't mean they suddenly disappear. You don't vaporize them. They still come down with a fair chunk of explosive in them, and they hit and explode where they land. I was last time I was in Ukraine, I was in Kyiv looking around at some of the damage, and you could see how some of this stuff wasn't targeted. It was just stuff had fallen out of the sky and caused damage. Now, that's not blaming the Ukrainians for shooting it down. It's just saying that the very success Ukraine is having at protecting its core infrastructure, stopping these drones hitting their intended target, doesn't mean they don't hit something. And tragically, there are a lot of people getting killed when they're there. And I I think you're off to Ukraine shortly as well. And I'd be surprised if, first of all, you'd imagine that Kyiv is like the London in the Blitz, and it's not. It's huge. It's a beautiful city. But of course, when things do come down, it's a densely populated area. Tragically, civilians die. So I think this is it's not about, in my humble opinion, it's not about Russia deliberately throwing valuable missiles into the middle of a city to try and take out a few buildings. I think it's Russia's incompetence at trying to target energy and industrial capability in Ukraine. And tragically, a lot of people are dying as a result of that.
And Ukraine is also carrying out its own air campaign on Russian energy and logistics. A power transformer went up in flames in the Krasnodar region just yesterday. That's also starting to have an impact on domestic fuel prices, we're hearing. If the Russians can't put a lid on Ukraine's own air offensive, what happens next?
Yeah, it's been fascinating, hasn't it? So Ukraine has been trying to take the fight to Russia. And if you look at this ground strategically, the West for a long time wouldn't give Ukraine the weapons that it needed to strike inside Russia. There was we'll give you weapons, but you can't fight back. You can strike Russian forces within Ukraine, but you can't strike them within Russia. So Ukraine has been very canny at going, okay, we need to develop our own weapons that can do that. And rather than just spray weapons around, they have specifically targeted energy infrastructure. Russia exports a lot of oil. It does a lot of refining of oil. And therefore, if you can take out some of these targets, they generally are quite flammable. You generally don't need a big explosive to set off a pretty huge explosion. And therefore, if you send a drone, which is very easy to shoot down, okay, I'll send 100 drones and one of them will get through. And Ukraine has been very effective at doing that. Part of the challenge is the long range stuff. Well, they may not be able to buy those off the shelf from the West, but my goodness, have they managed to get all the bits required, throw them together and trial them. If that was in the West, we'd have to do lots of safety cases and we'd have to do trials, all of which would take months or years. Ukraine just bolts them together, fires them off and sees what happens. And if they get to the target, woo! And if they don't, okay, let's try doing it slightly differently. And it's much quicker, much more agile. And I think that's proven to be very effective for Ukraine. I think we've got to be quite careful, though, to overthink that. Some of our long-range missiles, drone technology, isn't just about a rocket, an explosive pack, and some sort of sensor, because you also want to make sure if it's worth attacking, it's probably worth defending. If it's worth defending, somebody's going to try and shoot your missile down. So how do you protect the missile to make sure it gets through? Now, if you do any of that, it becomes quite expensive, but it becomes more survivable. If you don't do that, you have to focus on quantity and just deluge the defenses to go in there. To date, what Ukraine is doing is just trying to deluge the defenses, and that's proving quite effective. And although, as you say, it is gradually making it more difficult in Russia. So oil prices, domestic fuel prices are going up, but it is worth setting into context. I had a quick look after you and I had a quick banter online. The average price of fuel now for Russians is, I think, 79 cents a litre. The average for us is about 110, 115 a litre. So it's still a fraction of the price that we pay in the West. So I wouldn't suddenly think that, Putin's under massive trouble, because it's still a lot cheaper than it is to fill up your gas tank in Russia than it is in this country. But it is just making it incrementally slightly worse every day.
And we talk about some of those weapons that Ukraine is using in the air. They've unveiled, as it were, last week, this new FP5 Flamingo missile. What sort of difference can an air weapon like that make?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things that intrigue me about this. So let's look at, it's a flamingo. Why is it a flamingo? Because the early missiles came out as pink, and somebody bantering sort of went, "Oh, it's a bloody flamingo," and that sort of stuck. Which is one of the ironies of war, isn't it? But it's a ground launch missile. It's got just over 1,000 kilogram warhead. That's pretty substantial. But in context, most of the bombs dropped in the Second World War were 1,000-pound bombs. This is over twice the size of warhead for that. Range about 3,000 kilometers, so it goes a long old way. And apparently Ukraine is trying to build about 200, 210 of these a month. So they've clearly got some ambitious challenges for it. If you saw pictures of it, it looks pretty substantial. And we're back into the, okay, how easy are these to get shot down? It's not clear how fast the thing is. Why does that matter? Well, the slower, the easier these things are to shoot down. The faster, the better. And first of all, I admire the fact that Ukraine's now developed its own capability to use long-range weapons, therefore less reliance on the West. But I go back to the point that when you see these weapons, they do look a little bit like Second World War weapons. They've got a slightly oldie, worldy look about them. Are they stealthy? Almost certainly not. Do they have any sort of sophisticated anti-jam capability? Almost certainly not. Can they do terrain following? Can they hide themselves at the bottom of valleys? It doesn't look like it. They may be able to, and therefore, now I don't want to be critical, but it's just a sense of, just because they can now do long-range weapons doesn't mean that the weapons that were being provided by the West don't have a place. They absolutely do. And I have no doubt at all that Russia will be looking to target some of the facilities that are making these missiles, because it's just another step to generate some military capability that is indigenous to Ukraine rather than relying on Western aid.
We'll get back to your video shortly, but first, many of you right now will be watching the show on your phone, tablet or laptop, completely unaware that this very second someone could be accessing your device and stealing your data. Using the internet without private internet access, VPN, is like letting Facebook post your diary. Your friends and family can read all your dirty secrets. A virtual private network, or VPN for short, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. It shields your digital life from those eyes who are looking to exploit your private information. Whenever you connect to the internet on a public Wi-Fi network at airports, coffee shops, friends' houses, or even at your own home, your data is at risk of being stolen. Your device is transmitting a great amount of information out into the open, which can be viewed by various different entities before reaching the intended website, such as your ISP, government censors, advertising companies, and more. Hackers on the same network can easily steal your personal data. With PIA, you're protected. But there's more. With PIA, you can access all your usual streaming services, including Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney+, even if you're outside your own region. All you need to do is open the app, select a server from 91 countries, and just like that, you're digitally there. And it's not just for fun. With recent legislation, more and more content is being restricted. PIA allows you to access the content and news that you want to watch. And with one PIA subscription, you can protect an unlimited number of devices, so that's the whole family covered. Follow the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen now to receive a massive 86% discount, making it just £1.57 per month. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and to top it off, you'll receive 4 additional months for free. Head to piavpn.com now and take control of your digital life.
Well, and just to finish, Sean, Friedrich Merz, Germany's chancellor, has said that we are preparing for a long war in Ukraine. We've talked a bit there about where Europe goes from here, but what is Europe's next step really after this? If the US isn't putting as much in, there's been talks about security guarantees, what they could look like. There's clearly still weapons like the Taurus missile that Ukraine want to be provided by the Europeans. What's Europe's next move, do you think, and what could its impact be on the war?
Yeah, I think Merz's comment were really interesting, but I return really to the sort of profound nature of what next. If you have got America largely losing interest, and it doesn't mean they're not going to provide weapons, but largely losing interest, the West has for the last 3.5 years provided anti-tank weapons, then tanks, then long-range missiles, then F-16 fighter jets. They've gradually ramped up the support provided. Has any of that stopped Russia's advances? No. Has it slowed it down? Yes. But if you are looking at how are you going to bring the war to an end, the war will only end when President Putin has achieved his objectives or President Putin is forced to stop. It looks very likely, if I was a military advisor to Putin, I'd be telling him to keep pushing because everything is going his way at the moment and the West seems to be fragmenting and he's getting more and more pals in China and as India as we talk. So you shift towards either we wait until Putin's achieves the objectives, and that has profound implications for global security, because once he's achieved those objectives, why wouldn't he come and do it again? And what lesson does that send to China, to North Korea, to Iran? Or somebody steps up and stops Putin. And I don't mean World War III, but I mean suddenly turned around and said, like, enough is enough. We are going to match what you're doing, and we are going to make life difficult. And I think simply doing what we've always done in the West, of providing support and weapons to Ukraine, hasn't achieved the objective. And arguably, it's actually making Ukraine even more badly off, because the longer the war goes on, the more people they lose, the more a generation is lost. And when the war stops, how on earth do they dig themselves out of trouble when they haven't got any of the sort of fighting age, working age men to bolster that? Not only to work, because obviously everybody can work, but to start families, to generate the next generation of people out there. So I do think that the West has got to firstly ramp up its weapon production, B, present a much more coherent front, and C, whilst I'm not a fan personally of boots on the ground, I think that's a big escalation. I think starting to step up through a no-fly zone of some form. The West's air power is significantly better than Russia's. It would cause Russia a major headache if that was to happen. It would provide a degree of security for Ukrainians, and would actually be a very robust message that enough is enough, Putin. So I think, and now I can imagine several listeners, in fact, a number of listeners would go, you're advocating we go to war with Russia. And I'm saying, no, I'm not. But I think that the bit of appeasement never works. Chamberlain in 1938, peace in our time, within a year we were at war. You know, war is horrible, war is dreadful, but Putin has started this. But if we leave it to Putin to stop, where will it stop? We have a military. I think there are ways in which the military can be used to bring this to a halt, because Putin doesn't want a world war. He may threaten it, but he doesn't want it. And actually, finally, make a credible, robust gesture. However unpalatable, what we're doing so far hasn't worked. So if we don't do something different, we have to reap the consequences. And I think they could be quite profound.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio, or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.